All right, hi everybody. Today or tonight, I want to do a quick explanation of a concept we call biological magnification. And biological magnification has to do with a toxin or poison tend to become concentrated as you move up a food chain or up higher trophic levels. And an example of that would be a pesticide known as DDT. And a pesticide is something that's used to kill insects, and DDT is considered a persistent pesticide because it doesn't break down over long periods of time. It was originally used, it was considered like a miracle chemical because when it was used in Africa, as an example, mosquito population went down, and with that, malaria went down as well. But anyway, with DDT, once it gets into a water supply, it's rapidly absorbed by phytoplankton and organisms like that, organisms that are photosynthetic. Here you see a aquatic food chain. We've talked about like something like this once before, or up the trophic levels that we talked about before. And so I have some numbers here for an environmental textbook to sort of give you reference for that. It's not important to remember the exact numbers, but it'll give you important sort of placement point. So if you have DDT at its runoff point, meaning you used it as a pesticide on a crop or something like that, and then it leaks into a stream, you end up with a very, very, very small percentage of that in the waterway. So 0.0000003 parts per million, which is, seems like an incredibly tiny, small number. And you're right by that. But by the time it reaches the zooplankton, you'll notice that it is far more concentrated. And now in the zooplankton, you could study it and find that in the zooplankton, it is 0.04 parts per million by that point. And so then tiny fish eat it, and by the time the minnows eat it, it's at 0.5 parts per million. And then slightly larger fish, needlefish, will eat those, and it's at 2 parts per million. And then by the time it gets to birds, it's 25 parts per million because it gets concentrated as it moves up the food chain. And one way to think about this is how many tiny pieces of zooplankton a minnow would eat. And part of that is, remember when we talked about these food pyramids or energy pyramids, and we talked about the second law of thermodynamics. Well, when an animal eats another animal, remember, there's an inefficiency in the energy harnessing. So you always lose like 90% of the energy. So a small animal has to eat a very large number of smaller animals, and a big animal has to eat a large number of those smaller animals because you're always losing energy as you move up the energy pyramid. However, DDT does not operate that same way. Since DDT is a fat-soluble pesticide and is not being broken down, it doesn't follow that same loss of the 90% like the energy does. So what ends up happening is animals that are eating higher up on the food web have to eat more of the animals below them because they're losing 90% of the energy. But the DDT gets concentrated because it doesn't follow that same 10% efficiency because it's not being used as energy. So the DDT ends up being eaten at a much, much higher rate because you're not losing it, you're actually accumulating it. So again, here's another picture of a energy pyramid, as I showed you before in a previous slide or previous lecture. And at the top here, you have this large bird, in this case, like a osprey. And what happens to the copepod is an herbivorous zooplankton. And so how many plankton will the copepod have to eat in its lifetime? Well, it ends up eating a large number of them because remember, it's losing the energy as it moves up the energy pyramid. It's always losing 90% of the energy, but it doesn't lose 90% of the DDT, it accumulates it. Now, it turns out what DDT does in this case, DDT, as it gets concentrated, it interferes with calcium metabolism, and what ends up happening for the osprey, the eggshells become extremely thin, and when the bird sits on them, they break. So you end up with generations of birds that have no offspring because of the DDT interfering with calcium metabolism. So the population ends up crashing. And so things like the osprey or this bald eagle or peregrine falcons and lots of different fish-eating birds were impacted. The American brown pelican, which is a fairly common bird off the coast, almost went extinct due to high concentrations of DDT in the tissues. So these chemicals, whether it's DDT or other toxins that are fat-soluble chemicals, become concentrated. And as you move up the food chain, again, there's more and more concentration of them. We call this biomagnification or biological magnification. Another related example of biomagnification is another chemical instead of DDT, PCBs. PCBs were manufactured chemicals and used in machinery and electrical transformers because they don't break down at high temperatures. PCBs mimic hormones, so they affect the reproductive cycle of the animals. And the problem with mammals and humans that live in the Arctic are also impacted by these chemicals because they're eating the same thing polar bears are, which is they're eating seals and fish and things like that. And when you're a female, say polar bear, and you're breastfeeding your young, the milk has a high portion of fat, and so it's giving the offspring molecules, these fat-soluble molecules like these PCBs, and they become concentrated then in your offspring as well.